I would do the cloud.
Got it.
Okay. Let's see what else. Share screen. If you got a Zoom bomber, you can click on people's faces, and then there's a thing that says mute, or you can kick them out.
Okay.
Yeah, you'd also kick them out by clicking on. If you leave that bar, that white bar on the right.
Yeah.
If you sort of hover over me, for example, do you see my name?
Yeah.
It says mute, and then if it says more, that more will give you an opportunity to kick me out. Stop my video, kick me out.
Great. Got it.
If you need anything, on the Hoover side, just ask the organizer or text me in some way. Okay.
Okay.
And everybody, and try to remind everybody to come to the reception. We also have an undergraduate forum for the first time.
Oh, nice.
Yeah.
I love that. You guys are the best. When's the forum? I mean, the last
the forum, which you should come to the general membership meeting, and the forum, the regular forum, is at 11:50 and 12:20. And everybody come to those, because I don't think we're going to have very many people for the last day. I'm worried a little bit, but if you come, then we'll have lots of people, and the right ones, the right people, which is more important than a lot. And it sounds sort of fascist when I said it that way. I didn't mean it that way. Not, so. yeah, I didn't mean it that way. But I meant it in a kind of sucking up to the audience way. Like you're the best audience. You're the best session of all the sessions.
Very happy.
This is good for my background. This is from I drew that. I was from 2019.
Looks like a great artist.
Yeah, that was from my 2019 conference, our 2019 conference. Okay, also we're going to be you'll see it, just type in undergraduate forum, go to more sessions and have a great session.
No, I just want one get this one over and then think about other things.
I'm gonna leave. Have a good session. Bye.
You're the best.
Thank you.
Thank you. Ciao.
Bye. So glad to meet you, everybody. Lucas is here, but so everything should be lovely. You know, it's like 15 minutes, right?
Right.
Okay. Well, I'm so nice to meet you in person, so to speak, because I've read your proposals and they're so cool, and it's really nice to have you aboard. So I guess we'll start with there was like a schedule that Wova made. So I guess we're going to start with Josh, then Fannie, then Lisa, then Rebecca, then Lucas. How's that sound to you?
Sounds good.
Sounds perfect.
Cool. Too bad we're not in person. It would be lovely to have a coffee afterwards with you all.
I know.
Let's see. Okay, we got 4 minutes. I was scrambled with time. I was going to come at 8 o'clock this morning, but I'm on the East Coast. I was so impressed, Lisa, with all the things that you do, like RAP, the refugees and Holocaust Commission, and, a lot of like amazing activities that really impressed me. And MFA and writing and English, and it's a lot of cool things.
It's exciting. I love working at I love working at a college because there's just so much room to do so many things.
I totally agree. I'm the same way. I try to be the same way. I'm not the same way, but I try. Oh, good.
I think the challenge is making sure we don't put too much on our plates.
No, that's huge. But, I wish I had talked to you before. I already did that. I'm too much on my plate.
I just applied for a sabbatical.
Good.
And I'll be finding out soon whether that comes to fruition. But so it's like even when we're in the midst of projects, we take on new ones, right? Yeah. No,
I know all too well. The sabbatical will do you well to refresh. You have to refresh our batteries.
Yes.
Oh, good. Everyone's here. Josh, Fannie. I can't see them though. I've been on Zoom for a year, but I'm not hardly a master of it. I think Zoom masters me, so it makes me most nervous. Yeah. But well,
I know exactly what you mean.
Hi, Lucas. How are things in France, in Corsica?
Hey, yeah, things are great.
Wow.
Very rainy, very cold, but
No, that's
otherwise,
cool.
otherwise good.
That's unusual. Like we don't associate
Little
Corsica
bit.
with that. So that's cool. Take pictures.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, Lucas represents the most furthest person from the PAMLA epicenter. He's in Corsica, in Ilrus. Hi, Cindy. Wow, Fanny, you're in Las Vegas, I assume.
No, I'm in LA. I'm back in LA.
Oh, wow.
How
Cool.
are you? Good morning, everyone.
Good morning, everyone. I'm so
Hey.
excited about our session. It's going to be really exciting, I think, and meaningful. And I hope you will all consider
Hello.
submitting your papers to. Hey, Josh.
Hi there.
Perfect timing.
I joined a minute ago, but I couldn't see or hear anything. Now I can see you guys.
Awesome. I hope you'll all consider sending your papers, submitting them to Green Humanities, because we're having a special session. I mean, not special session. What is it? Special issue on this topic of environmental justice, and all your papers look really amazing. So I hope you'll consider submitting them. So it's 12:15. So and since we have 5 panelists, we're actually considered like a round table. Let's get started. And we know the imperatives of environmental justice, what's going on now, and we know that we have to act. So let's act now with our papers. I'll start with Josh, then Fanny, then Lisa, then Rebecca, then Lucas. So for those of you who don't know Josh, he's Josh Weinstein. He's an associate professor in English and a faculty member in the Environmental Studies program at Virginia Wesleyan University, which is in Virginia Beach, Virginia. Josh received his PhD in English from the State University of New York at Buffalo in 2007, and his research and teaching interests include American nature writing and eco-poetry with an eye towards ethical engagements with the text. He's a co-founder and co-editor with me of Green Humanities, and he was speaking today on Benjamin Zephaniah's Me Green poem as eco-justice anthem. So we're excited, Josh, to hear your paper.
Thank you. Yeah, good morning, everyone. Thanks for tuning in. So yes, the title of my paper, as Peter said, is Benjamin Zephaniah's Me Green poem as eco-justice anthem. As the United States continues to stumble its way through what many have termed a racial reckoning regarding policing practices in communities of color and police brutality against people of color, parallel conversations are being reignited regarding the uneven application of environmentalist ideals and ecological care that often breaks along lines of race and socioeconomic status, taking the path of, quote, least political resistance, as Fred de Sam Lazaro puts it in a recent interview with Bill Finney, former police chief of St. Paul, Minnesota. In this context, those of us working in the field of environmental literature and eco-poetry in particular are forced to reconsider the question posed so eloquently by John Feldsteiner in his 2010 book of the same title, Can Poetry Save the Earth? Only now we're left to wonder, how can we ensure that, quote, saving the earth looks out for the interests of people of color and those living in socially and economically disadvantaged circumstances? In this paper, I'll argue that Benjamin Zephaniah's Me Green poem, published in his 1992 book, City Psalms, is ahead of its time in putting its finger on several strands of this complex question. In particular, by way of satire and humor, Zephaniah argues for those in power to take greater responsibility for problems that they were most involved in either creating or allowing to fester, while absolving, to an extent, disempowered communities from blame and guilt for our modern environmental problems. Zephaniah's poem is a brutal takedown of what he sees as oppressive powers that be, who are belatedly attempting to turn their attention to the cause of the environment. Throughout Me Green poem, Zephaniah satirizes the moneyed white powers that be, invoking a slippage between various senses of going green or being green. From the start, Zephaniah proclaims this as, quote, Me Green poem, setting up the expectation that he'll follow in the footsteps of the, quote, singer-songwriters that he lampoons in the third movement of the poem. These latter who hold charity benefit concerts and donate money to environmental causes, but don't seem to alter the overall situation in the poet's view. Instead, we see that Zephaniah is quite critical of the Johnny-come-lately environmentalism of the wealthy and powerful. Take, for example, the first stanza or movement of the poem, which reads as follows. And I'll quote the whole first stanza here. Everybody talking about protecting the planet as if we just come on it, hard to understand it. Everybody talking about the green revolution, protecting the children and fighting pollution. But check, Capitalism and greed has caused us to need clean air to breathe. Yes, when you get hot under the collar, you suddenly discover that you're going green all over. For years, you have been fighting wars and destroying the scene. And now that you're dying, you start turn green. That's the first stanza of the poem. In the first 3 lines alone, the poet sets the tone of his poem. Using reggae-inspired cadence and Jamaican Creole instead of standard British English, Zephaniah expresses incredulity at, quote, everybody talking about protecting the planet as if we just come on it and hard to understand it. In a line of criticism that has only grown stronger with the passage of nearly 30 years since the poem's first publication in 1992, he calls out those who have consistently ignored or failed to sufficiently address ecological problems with urgency, instead earning money and gaining power all along through environmental exploitation and destruction, only to turn around and express dismay at the environmental degradation and global warming that has resulted. As he writes, quote, yes, when you get hot under the collar, you suddenly discover that you're going green all over. Here, going green all over takes on a more menacing aspect, implying that our mistreatment of the earth has caused us to become sick. And now we're turning a sickly shade of green due to our failure to safeguard the earth. Similarly, Zephaniah implicates capitalist greed in particular, as in the following quoted lines from above, but check capitalism and greed has caused us to need clean air to breathe. Writing from England, the epicenter of the Industrial Revolution and the modern era of pollution, Zephaniah places the blame for our current predicament squarely at the feet of those that stood to gain the most from the exploitation of our environment. Furthermore, Zephaniah connects not only moneyed interests to environmental degradation, but he also fingers wars as particularly detrimental to the natural world. For example, each stanza or movement of the poem contains the following 4-line refrain at or near its ending. Quote, for years, you have been fighting wars and destroying the scene, and now that you're dying, you start turn green. In these lines, Zephaniah links wars against human beings as simultaneously being acts of ecological violence against our home, the earth. Further, he begins the 4th movement of the poem with the following statement that, quote, now when it comes to wars, governments are funny, lives are secondary, first is bloody money, followed by a dozen areas of recent conflict with a common thread of colonial or post-colonial context. Each is followed by the declaration, quote, that's war, except for Northern Ireland, which Zephaniah sarcastically labels as, quote, just a problem, a nod to the British government's longtime downplaying of the conflict in Northern Ireland as, quote, the Troubles, despite the use of British troops and armored vehicles there. While he does not walk us through the mechanics of how war is harmful to the planet, written shortly after the first Gulf War that saw the purposeful burning of Kuwaiti oil wells by retreating Iraqi forces, and only a couple of decades after the USA last dropped Agent Orange defoliant chemical on the jungles of Vietnam, it's all too easy to imagine some of the myriad ways that war destroys not only people and infrastructure, but also the health of the ecosystems upon which we depend. The tie-in to environmental justice is perhaps most clearly seen in the 3rd stanza of the poem, where Zephaniah declares, quote, my people were rich but robbed, and we were healthy, so I don't know about you, but me, I plead not guilty. Zephaniah, who was born the son of Barbadian and Jamaican parents in Birmingham, England, and who grew up partly there and partly in Jamaica, invokes the legacy of British imperialism and the exploitation of both indigenous Caribbean peoples as well as African Caribbean people who were enslaved on those islands. Here as above, with regard to the wars he lists, Zephaniah does not elaborate on his meaning explicitly. It's up to the reader to connect the dots that Zephaniah's, quote, my people were robbed of their labor and their autonomy, with both slavery and British domination of the islands of Barbados and Jamaica continuing until the 1830s for slavery and the early 1960s with respect to political independence from Britain. Famously, just over a decade after publishing Me Green poem, Zephaniah pens an opinion piece for The Guardian in which he explains why he refused to accept the prestigious OBE award, which would have made him an officer of the Order of the British Empire, that then Prime Minister Tony Blair had confidentially invited him to receive from Queen Elizabeth at Buckingham Palace in November 2003. That was to be in an end-of-the-year ceremony. There, Zephaniah writes, quote, me, OBE, whoever is behind this offer can never have read any of my work, end quote. He goes on to explain his, quote, anti-empire stance, shedding light on Me Green poem in the process. I'll quote here at length because Zephaniah unpacks a lot of what is compressed in Me Green poem. Quote, me, I thought, OBE me, up yours, I thought. I get angry when I hear that word empire. It reminds me of slavery. It reminds me of thousands of years of brutality. It reminds me of how my foremothers were raped and my forefathers brutalized. It is because of this concept of empire that my British education led me to believe that the history of Black people started with slavery and that we were born slaves and should therefore be grateful that we were given freedom by our caring white masters. It is because of this idea of empire that Black people like myself don't even know our true names or our true historical culture. I'm not one of those who are obsessed with the roots, and I'm certainly not suffering from a crisis of identity. My obsession is about the future and the political rights of all people. Benjamin Zephaniah, OBE, no way, Mr. Blair, no way, Mrs. Queen, I am profoundly anti-empire. That's from 27 November 2003. For Zephaniah then, to be, quote, rich but robbed is bound up in a long history of exploitation, with the current ecological and political crises being but a further manifestation of long festering problems for which Zephaniah declares himself and his people, quote, not guilty. And elsewhere, Zephaniah kind of expands upon the idea of Blackness and refers to it as not being only African Caribbean people or African people of African heritage, but he includes those that are marginalized, Asian peoples, even white women who are oppressed in one way or another. So it's interesting. It's a bigger discussion, but he does expand upon that idea. The guilt, according to Zephaniah, lies with governments, such as that of England, that exploit people and resources in pursuit of money and power, leaving destruction in their wake. In a haunting few lines toward the end of the poem's final section, the poet adds to the earlier refrain of fighting wars and starting to turn green as follows, quote, for years you have been getting technological, but ignoring the facts, and now you're so technical, but you cannot relax. Here, Zephaniah is critical of government and society's ability to identify and measure the environmental problems that we're causing, while nonetheless carrying on, quote, ignoring the facts. And this is a particularly acute problem in the United States, I might add. Now that these problems are unavoidable, quote, you cannot relax. It is humbling, to say the least, that Zephaniah's 1992 poem might well have been written in our own day, nearly 30 years later. While the COP26 has just wrapped up in Glasgow, Scotland, with some encouraging developments on the climate action front, the simple fact that nearly 30 years after the United Nations first held the Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, and the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change was adopted, also in 1992, we're still struggling to grapple with the changes needed to limit climate change, shows that we truly, quote, cannot relax. Furthermore, the reticence of most developed nations to take up the issue of a climate loss and damage fund to help compensate less developed nations for the climate impacts they suffer, despite emitting a smaller share of greenhouse gases, shows that Zephaniah's insights here on the need to hold those in power to account is needed, perhaps now more than ever. Thank you. And this project is very much a work in progress. So I welcome your questions, comments, and suggestions in our discussion period.
Oh, you're muted, Professor.
Oh, too bad. I just said I really appreciated that paper, and I didn't know that author before, so I'm really excited. So we'll hold our questions maybe for the end, and we'll get through all of them, and we can have like a symbiosis. So our next speaker is Fannie Dubini, who graduated in law and literature. She's a professor of French studies at CSUF, and she's written numerous articles on Marcel Proust in French Forum, and Marcel Proust aujourd'hui, and Los Angeles Review of Books, and she's published a really fascinating essay on Proust called Proust in Black, or Proust en Noir, which has been translated by Bruce Whiteman in English at SDSU Press. And she's interested in cultural landscapes and literary ecologies. And she's currently working on a novel. And she lives in LA. So thank you, Fannie. Soon be speaking on Rainer Banham, 1971 to 2021, Architecture and Eco-Justice in Today's Los Angeles. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. I'm really happy to join this session this morning. Now, I have a question before I start my presentation. Is there a way to share a few slides with the audience?
Absolutely. I'm going to try to make you a co-host too. Maybe we should make everyone a co-host. This should do.
That should be able, I think.
Yay. Okay, lovely.
Perfect. Thank you.
Thank you. It's making me jealous. I want to be in LA now.
Yes, just a few. It's actually quite sunny this morning. You would enjoy it.
I know.
Alors, my paper, by the way, will be in French. I hope this is not an issue, but there will be quotes in English. Yes, I think I mentioned that to you quite a few weeks ago. And so Los Angeles, l'architecture des 4 écologies de Los Angeles de Rainer Bynum, pensée sur la 5e colonne. Alors que nous marquons cette année la célébration du 50e anniversaire de la publication de l'essai Los Angeles, The Architecture of Four Ecologies de Rainer Bynum, publié chez Harper & Row en 1971, j'aimerais revenir en introduction de cette présentation pour mieux situer le contexte de mon propos sur la personnalité résolument atypique de son auteur, Rainer Bynum, critique architectural anglais qui eut pour programme dans les années 70 de révolutionner la perception que le public pouvait entretenir sur la ville de Los Angeles. Né à Norwich en 1922 en Angleterre, ingénieur de formation, Bynum rejoint le monde de l'université et de la critique à l'issue de ses études doctorales sur l'architecture moderne et devient l'un des chefs de file d'une architecture consciente, plus environnementale, rejetant ainsi le formalisme technique des écoles précédentes, en particulier l'école du Bauhaus. Il enseigne à la Bartlett School of Architecture, UCL, University of Central London, pour migrer ensuite aux États-Unis et remplir plusieurs fonctions académiques. D'abord comme directeur du département des Design Studies à l'Université de Buffalo, puis comme professeur à l'Université de Santa Cruz et USC à Los Angeles, en Californie. Pour ses défenseurs comme pour ses détracteurs, Bynum appartient à ce mouvement du cool British intellectual cruising. Alors, you can see that on, this great photo of Tim Street Porter, qui voit en l'expat britannique aussi bien un génial visionnaire qu'un parfait imposteur. Dans le numéro de décembre 1972 du magazine Art Forum, Peter Plegans ne prend d'ailleurs aucun détour et conclut sa revue de l'essai de Bynum par le couperet d'une critique assassine. Ray Bradbury was hard to figure out, but the trouble with Rainer Bynum is that the fashionable son of a bitch doesn't have to live here. Talking about Los Angeles. Pour d'autres plus favorables à la vision écologique que propose Bynum dans son essai, la révolution consiste à percevoir Los Angeles au travers de 4 écologies. 4 environnements ou écosystèmes urbains que l'auteur décrit au travers de la nomenclature suivante. La plage, Surfurbia, les collines, Foothills, les plaines d'Usa, The Plains of Id, et les autoroutes, Autopia. D'emblée, le lecteur perçoit dans la terminologie de cette classification le rôle central de l'imaginaire, comme si l'architecture était reléguée au rang de footnote de l'histoire architecturale et urbaine de Los Angeles. C'est d'ailleurs le cas puisque l'essai de Bynum ne prévoit seulement qu'un court chapitre en conclusion dédié à l'architecture. En plaçant donc l'imaginaire au cœur de sa réflexion, le critique anglais rejoint par ailleurs toute une communauté d'artistes, d'écrivains et de réalisateurs qui, dans les années 70 en Californie, après les événements sanglants du Watts, 1965, contribuent à transformer la perception que se fait le public de Los Angeles. Si Bynum, en intello cool, cruise la ville à vélo ou à bord d'une voiture, c'est au volant de sa Corvette Stingray que Joan Didion parcourt la mégalopole. La Autopia, chez Didion, devient elle aussi source de rêverie poétique. Pour elle, la conduite automobile induit presque un état hypnotique. And I quote Joan Didion, "Actual participation requires a total surrender, a concentration so intense as to seem a kind of narcosis, a rapture of the freeway." End of quote, écrit-elle dans son essai On the Road. Né en 1934 à Sacramento, Didion revient en Californie en 1965 et décide de s'y installer avec son mari John Gregory Dunne jusque dans les années 80 pour résider d'abord à Hollywood et à Malibu au bord du Pacifique. Pénétré par cette conscience permanente de vivre sur une ligne de rupture en zone sismique, Didion a su avec brio mettre en lumière dans son œuvre la ligne ténue de partage, the fault line, qui sépare le charmant du cruel à Los Angeles. Mieux que quiconque, Didion a su mettre en évidence cette tension permanente à Los Angeles pour ceux qui la vivent et qui à tout moment peut faire basculer la perception d'une écologie fantasmée à une écologie redoutée. Quote, "There is something uneasy in the Los Angeles air this afternoon, some unnatural stillness, some tension. What it means is that tonight a Santa Ana wind will begin to blow. A hot wind from the northeast, winding down through the Cajon and San Gorgonio passes, blowing up sandstorms out along Route 66, drying the hills and the nerves to flashpoint." End of quote. Si le lien entre géographie, écologie et imaginaire est donc clairement défini dans l'approche écologique de Banham et de Didion, c'est cette même filiation critique et littéraire que je revendique dans mon essai Los Angeles, A Proustian Fiction, paru aux éditions Passage et SDSU Press en 2019. Dans mon essai, l'écologie de Los Angeles devient elle-même proustienne, c'est-à-dire que dans la ville comme l'œuvre, le centre ne tient plus, la périphérie où le centre est partout et où nulle part. Quiconque cherche à entrer dans l'œuvre de Proust doit d'abord apprendre à se perdre, comme le faisait Banham à Los Angeles dans les années 70. Ma relation avec Reyner Banham a donc été pour moi déterminante. Académique européenne expatriée à Los Angeles dans les années 2000, ma lecture de l'essai Four Ecologies of Architecture m'a permis de trouver l'un des points d'entrée dans la ville. Ne possédant aucune référence, aucun code et sans possibilité d'appréhender la ville à pied, la philosophie d'ailleurs ne s'est-elle pas constituée en marchant, comme on le fait généralement dans une ville européenne, ma compréhension de l'écologie de Los Angeles s'est d'abord constituée sur le mode de l'imaginaire, à travers la littérature. Aujourd'hui, l'écriture s'est ajoutée à la littérature, mais Los Angeles reste pour moi un terrain expérimental, un terrain de jeu, de recherche, un terreau imaginaire fertile. Alors, que peut-on dire encore de l'essai de Reyner Banham aujourd'hui en 2021, 50 ans après sa publication? Lorsqu'il publie son essai en 1971, Banham fait partie d'une époque qui s'apprête à tourner une nouvelle page de l'histoire. Avec la guerre du Vietnam en toile de fond, Los Angeles, même si elle ne se le sait pas encore, se prépare à entrer dans l'ère de la globalisation, qui sera d'ailleurs précipitée par les deux chocs pétroliers consécutifs de 1973 et 1979. Avec la globalisation est venue, on le sait, l'interdépendance des économies mondiales, mais aussi le cortège des problèmes écologiques, sociaux et urbains qui lui sont attachés, avec en particulier une crise environnementale et une crise du logement sans précédent à Los Angeles. Alors aujourd'hui, sur fond de crise planétaire et avec pour principal responsable la globalisation, comment est-il encore possible d'envisager les 4 écologies de Banham? Faut-il en envisager une 5e? Si oui, laquelle? Si les critiques s'accordent généralement sur le fait que les 4 écologies originales de Banham, la plage, Suburbia, les collines, foothills, les plaines d'Usa, Plains of Id et les autoroutes à Autopia continuent de structurer l'imaginaire de la ville, l'urgence de la catastrophe écologique, humaine et sanitaire. Je rappelle que d'après les derniers chiffres de l'Agence d'aide locale aux sans-abri, on a comptabilisé plus de 13% d'augmentation de la population des sans-abri à Los Angeles, qui fait un total de plus de 150 000 sans-abri aujourd'hui dans l'État, l'un des États, sinon l'État le plus riche américain. Donc, dans cette situation de catastrophe écologique, humanitaire et sanitaire, les décideurs et les architectes ne peuvent que repenser l'espace urbain de Los Angeles autrement. Au sein même de la tradition instituée par Banham, de nouvelles voies donc émergent et proposent une vision qui prolonge et renouvelle la perception que Banham pouvait se faire de Los Angeles. Pour Margaret Crawford, qui enseigne l'histoire de l'architecture et du design à Berkeley, il n'y aura pas de pensée possible d'une écologie future sans une intégration de l'automobile. Je cite. I have a different opinion about the car. The car is a technological marvel that is both wonderful in its freedom and flexibility, but in many respects also destructive. But there is no going back. People will not stop using their cars. In Europe, where there is every disincentive for car use is still rising dramatically. So the idea of eliminating the automobile is just a dream. And for me, not even a good dream. I don't want to give up my automobile. The thing I miss most about Los Angeles is driving and parking. End of quote. Dans l'ouvrage édité par Raoul Merotra, intitulé Everyday Urbanism, publié en 2011 par Michigan University Press, Margaret Crawford propose une écologie donc de la fantaisie quotidienne, an ecology of fantasy, comme vous pouvez le voir sur ce, as you can see it on this picture, on this slide, qui consisterait à prendre en compte l'appropriation ou la réappropriation spontanée, hétérogène, quotidienne de l'environnement économique, social et urbain par les communautés qui la composent. Je cite. Everyday urbanism delights in the spontaneous and indigenous, in the ways that migrant groups, for instance, appropriate and adapt to their ad hoc conditions and marginal spaces. There are the flea markets in parking lots and the garage sales in private driveways and front yards. Even drinking fountains for dogs in public parks. The city is shaped more by the forces of everyday life than by formal design and official plans. It champions vernacular architecture in vibrant ethnic neighborhoods, like the barrios of Los Angeles. Everyday urbanism prefers street murals to fine art, local street vendors to national chain stores, although it is sympathetic to the people who hang out in malls. It is the bottom demographic sector of the economy, a sort of community capitalism. End of quote. Pour Jia Jigou, directrice du Mack Center for Art and Architecture, et Rosario Talevi, architecte, curatrice et fondatrice de la Soft Agency, la proposition d'une 5e écologie qui s'ajouterait aux 4 écologies de Banham prend des accents plus humanistes, en revendiquant notamment une écologie du care et du repair, en s'appuyant notamment sur le travail de l'anthropologue sociale et féministe Marie Puig de la Bella Casa. Dans son ouvrage Matters of Care, publié aux universités de Minnesota Press, Maria Puig de la Bella Casa propose un texte redéfinissant la notion de care, an ecology of care and repair, depuis l'exigence d'une éthique pour des mondes qui ne sont pas seulement humains ou qui sont plus qu'humains, more than human worlds. La réflexion porte alors sur tout ce que nous faisons ou devrions faire pour maintenir et réparer notre monde, suivant la définition du care livrée par Joan Tronto et Berenice Fisher, ce dernier étant composé d'êtres humains, mais également, c'est important, de choses, d'objets, d'autres animaux, d'êtres vivants, d'organismes, de forces physiques et d'entités spirituelles. Fin de citation. Pour une ville aussi hétéroclite que Los Angeles, une écologie du care, an ecology of care, prendrait en effet tout son sens. Elle viendrait apporter une tentative de réponse à la crise humanitaire et sanitaire à laquelle fait face la population croissante des sans-abri. Et enfin, en ne se présentant pas seulement comme l'exigence d'une éthique envers les humains, l'écologie du Caire porterait aussi en elle ce devoir éthique envers les constructions et les œuvres humaines du passé. Une exigence enfin qui me semble être une véritable urgence aujourd'hui à Los Angeles, lorsqu'on sait que presque chaque semaine, un témoin architectural du passé est démoli dans l'indifférence presque générale pour continuer de satisfaire les appétits toujours plus voraces des promoteurs immobiliers. Merci.
Thank you, Fanny. How do we get out of the screen? Can you? Good. Thank you. Yeah, that was really interesting. But when we get to the Q&A, I hope you'll be able to translate some of it for our Anglophone audience.
Yes.
Some of the quotes were good, but the rest. But it was very interesting. We're really grateful. But yeah, we'll need a second part. And now I'm pleased to introduce Lisa Tucker, who is a professor of English at Raritan Community College in Branchburg, New Jersey, in Somerset County. Her research interest area is in modern-day war, specifically in Palestine. Her other research area is refugee literature, and Lara teaches English composition, African-American lit, short story, drama, and world literature. She serves on the Paul Robeson Advisory Committee, the Holocaust and Genocide Advisory Committee, and volunteers with the Refugee Assistance Program, RAP, R-A-P. She has an MFA in creative writing from Sierra Nevada University, an EDM in education at Teachers College at Columbia, and an MA in English at Rutgers. So we're very pleased to hear your paper on the impact of global warming in Embolo Mbui's How Beautiful We Are.
Thank you. Okay, so I will argue how Embolo Mbui's novel, How Beautiful We Were, is an ideal text to use in an eco-justice and or business ethics unit or course. The novel is multidisciplinary in three ways: literary, environmental, and philosophical, socio-political. The novel How Beautiful We Were is about eco-justice. The setting takes place in three places: in Kosawa, a fictitious African village of bamboo barns and huts; a second place, Bezam, another fictitious African village. However, in this village, everything is clean; and a third locale, Lokunja, an African village, possibly in Tanzania, that is Sin City. In Kosawa, the African villagers who love their home are pained over seeing their home turned to destroyed land, damaged by man-made chemical ingredients deposited by Pexton American Oil Company. The adults, Mama, Papa, Basau, Kakadi, Jakani, Teacher Penda, almost give up hope. However, the children in the novel, who were born in 1970, including Thula, Juba, Wambi, Jakani, Sakani, they make the choice to retaliate. The children are forced to take on the Pexton top supervisors. The government soldiers, the gas-guzzling Americans, Woja Beki, who is African, but has turned against his own. The children also take on the government, and they take on Pexton drilling laborers. I'll now analyze the story from three multidisciplinary perspectives. First, from a literary critic's perspective, Mbu uses multiple narrators to describe the happenings. Mbu introduces characters who are on different sides of the fence. We have perpetrators of eco-injustice, bystanders of eco-injustice, problem solvers, and victims. Some bystanders are Africans, and some of the problem solvers are Americans. Mbu includes 11 or more symbols The symbols are from both the natural world and the artificial world, but primarily from the natural world. We have blood and ancestors, which equals heritage and identity and rootedness. We have the garden, which is ironically the name of the oil factory. We have bodies, which equals being able to weather any storm. Herbs and potions, and they supposedly equal healing, yet they bring about a spiritual nourishment, which is not always enough of an armor. Another symbol, water, which is both life and death because of acid rain and poisoned water. Another symbol, pregnant women, as in Toni Morrison's slavery novel, Beloved. The pregnant women must decide whether to bring a child into this atrocity. Further, if the women do go full term and have the deliveries, the children are usually deformed. Another symbol, coffins. This is equated with the amount of precious space you took up while you were on Earth. Another symbol, schools. The school is a safe haven and a place for gaining knowledge. Then we have, extracted from that, knowledge by itself. Knowledge is used as the opposite of poison. Teeth, the white teeth versus the brown rotting teeth, and what you can tell about a person's character based on his, her, their teeth. And finally, cars from the artificial world. Cars, they're the reminder of American capitalism. They are the symbol of corruption. They're also a reminder of the ability to be a bystander and escape the country. From an environmental perspective, the reader is introduced to characters Juba and Jakani, who are dying because of soil erosion and airborne environmental poisons. Implications of rising sea levels, increased heat waves, droughts, floods, storms, food insecurity, and violence increase. Women, children, and future generations are disproportionately affected. Toxic waste is being dumped into the village rivers, which in turn flow to the ocean, which in turn kills the fish and the plants, which is the sustenance for these villagers from this fictitious African locale. And in turn, the people end up being toxic and many of them are killed. The topic of Anthropocene, anthro-man, seen, new, becomes very real. Anthropocene, is defined as the period where human activity has been the dominant influence on climate and the environment. And then finally, third and finally, I will look at this text from this philosophical and eco-socio-political perspective. Imbue exposes settler colonialism by creating a hierarchical system where the CEO of the oil company is far removed from the day-to-day drillings and dealings. The drillers do the dirty work while Pexton's CEO keeps clean hands. Woja, an African who serves as a liaison between the villagers and Pexton, allowed his business, his corporation, to be bought. In other words, Woja sells his soul and pays for this with his life. The children make statements about the divide to adults who chuckle. One such example is when Thula says to her papa, "I wouldn't want their tainted, evil American oil in my pure, good African car." The ethical violations continue. Children are being born deformed, as I mentioned earlier with the pregnant women. Pexton builds a clinic. This is it's like a smokescreen. and it's supposed to solve the problem, something that we see so frequently. Paxton also builds a school in the very location, Kasawa, where the children are dying. Unscrupulous Paxton, as the company is personified, holds a forum for the villagers every 8 weeks. That too is a smoking screen. Also, ethically, Paxton pays off villagers, like Woja Beki, not to complain. An ethical scene that will resonate with Americans is a scene which, similar to in Flint, Michigan, and Suffolk, Virginia, has tainted water permanently. In Imbue's novel, the Paxton supervisors tell the villagers that they've tested the water and that it is fine. They add, you may, quote, you may boil it for a half hour for assuredness, but it is fine, close quote. Yet children die after mothers have boiled the water for even 2 or 3 hours. Another ethical crime is when the grown male African villagers inquire from the government about medicine for all of the illnesses taking place. What happens in turn is that the men go missing. This raises the question, did we sell our souls to the government? An ethical and philosophical question raised by Imbue is, if Paxton's imperialistic ways, if in Paxton's imperialistic ways, he's justified as bringing civilization to Africa, then are Paxton's ways wrong? Another ethical and philosophical question Imbue raises is, how can Paxton, who represents America, be happy when the African children are dying because of actions committed by Americans? 2 additional questions Imbue raises are, is it better to walk away, as would be done if Lusaka gives the Africans cars so that they can drive away from the insanity, or Paxton giving money to the American orchestrated restoration movement, which serves as hush money because the eco-injustice serves as as hush money because the eco-injustice made the American newspapers. Imbue was a businessman. Imbue, the author, was a business management major at Rutgers University and Columbia University. And although she lived a comfortable life growing up in the Cameroon, as an adult, she realized that in her country, resource extraction was taking place. Resource extraction, natural resources, not bringing in funding and wealth for the people of the unnamed African country. Cameroon was colonialized by the British, the exploitation of the matriarchal society. Imbue wanted to tackle food sovereignty or security. Sorry, I'm just like skipping some. Okay. In closing, in Bolo Imbue's novel, How Beautiful We Were, the most innocent of victims, who were the villagers, they affect change. Innocent Thulsa and the other children become a part of integral ecology because they force the government to address unjust policies and laws. And then in closing, my final sentence, acknowledging imperialism is the only way to begin a path to justice. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. That was interesting, inspiring. Now we'll move along to sorry, Art Baker.
Hello.
Baker, I think you're next.
Oh, yes. I just go by my last name, Baker,
Oh,
but
okay, yeah, I wasn't sure. So sorry.
not to worry.
Yeah, is a PhD candidate at the University of Santa Barbara. She are broadly interested in cultural construction of speculative scientific discourses, including science fiction with a focus on decolonial world building, climate justice, multi-species ecologies, and radical utopian imaginaries. Their work is situated at the intersections of contemporary science fiction, feminist science, and technological studies, and the environmental humanities. Current project focuses on speculative, imperialist human futures in space travel, exploration, and colonization. So today, the title of your paper is going to be Garbage People, Metabolic Waste Management, and Worker Revolutionary in Waste Tide and Lunar
Luna Braceros.
Luna Braceros. Sorry.
Yes. Thank you so much, Professor. I'm happy to be here, everyone. I'll be sharing my screen. I have a few slides, and forgive me for looking over this way. I have my presentation on another screen. So without further ado, let me just go ahead. Here we are. All right. Can everyone see that?
Yes.
All right.
Yes.
Excellent. Excellent. Whoops. Pardon me. All right. Writing during the Industrial Revolution, Karl Marx understood worker exploitation and budding concerns of global climate change to be fundamentally intertwined as a form of metabolic rift, a dangerous imbalance of carbon-based energy emissions, soil nutrients, and human labor across urban and rural landscapes. This metabolic rift is both reflected within and deeply informed by extractive, globalized capitalist economic systems that depend equally on the consumption of fossil fuels and working class bodies. Just as cheap labor markets rely on a surplus population and speculative markets on a surplus of credit debt, human-driven climate change depends upon the fiction of infinite surplus, apparently limitless human and non-human resources to be used up and discarded as quickly as possible. In her recent book, After Geoengineering, environmental humanities scholar Holly Jean Buck suggests that thinking about metabolic rift in terms of debt is a useful conceptual framework for grasping the nature and severity of the problem. Our headlong dash into explosive growth based on a fossil fuel economy is akin to a hyperextended line of credit, where our parents and grandparents recklessly put up the planet's well-being as collateral. Accruing cumulative interest at a frightening rate, this ill-advised loan, overwhelmingly the fault of the global north, has been unceremoniously shoved onto the shoulders of the current generation and will in turn be passed on to eons of the yet unborn. Acknowledging the socio-technical impossibility of a single dramatic solution to fix climate change, that is, short of eco-fascism or global apocalypse, Buck further suggests that the only viable way of systemically addressing this staggering imbalance is to frame it as a planetary, multi-generational waste management project. If we are to have any hope of restoring our world to something like it was, then cleaning up after the gross indiscretions of our ancestors, who imagined their lives as self-contained and wholly exempt from the moral culpability of secondary effects, must necessarily become the humble and collective task of our foreseeable future. In this presentation, I explore the potentially radical nature of Buck's suggestion that the shit work, generally reserved for the lowest and least valued members of society, could suddenly be elevated to the function of quite literally saving the world. As many climate justice activists besides Buck have noted, the communities, environments, and bodies that bear the brunt of the toxicity and the catastrophic effects of climate change are generally those that are least responsible for its existence. The global south, the working poor, communities of color, segregated to neighborhoods that abut freeways and garbage dumps. But could this very objection, this unjust and unsolicited responsibility for mounting carbon debt, for literal tons of waste that you had no part in producing, could this lead to climate-centric and collective models of revolutionary praxis? Here I trace these questions through a brief look at Chen Chufan's Waste Tide and Rosaura Sanchez and Beatriz Pita's Luna Braceros, two recent science fiction novels that deftly combine the discourses of climate crisis, the failures of capitalism, and the cycles of waste, sequestered in landfills, prisons, and stagnating gig economies, with the possibility of proletarian revolution. Both novels offer a cogent exploration and critique of capitalist systems that metabolically gorge and disgorge. Trashed components and human as garbage become curiously imbricated within wasted opportunity, wasted causes, and wasted ecosystems, as well as the recyclic nature of debt, which the workers' budding class consciousness slowly reframes as moral rather than monetary. Lives that are always already deemed perfunctory take on new worth when reconfigured as elements of a self-sustaining collective. Waste tide, set in the not too distant future in the midst of China's e-waste and plastics recycling industry, exposes the overdetermined hypocrisy at the core of monetizing these endeavors, which perpetuate the very exploitation that they claim to mitigate. Lunabraceros, a dystopian future where prison slave labor is sent to the moon to handle radioactive waste, begins to imagine ways in which the dominant narratives and technologies of carceral surveillance and control can be repurposed as tools of anti-hegemonic and grassroots resistance. Both novels thus open the possibility of revolutionary praxis occurring as a refusal of abjection at the intersections of metabolic rift and labor exploitation, a shift of consciousness away from individual monetary success and toward collective moral duty. Because I'm well aware of time constraints, I can't delve as deeply into the complexities of either book as I would like. However, I will touch briefly on the plots of both novels as they relate to these themes. Chen's Waste Tide takes place in a port hub city called Silicon Isle, which is an unsubtle jab at Silicon Valley, in which the landowners, or the natives as they're referred to in the novel, have made their fortune buying and recycling plastic and e-waste trash from the United States. Appropriate to the Buddhist belief in reincarnation and to the abnormal climate patterns precipitated by carbon-saturated air and acidified oceans, Waste Tide is a novel of cycles that have been thrown out of balance. Although Silicon Isle is a fictional location, Chen's novel is written within the real-world Chinese recycling industry. He actually grew up in a coastal town that engaged in plastics recycling. This legally dubious and ill-regulated enterprise causes port cities to become inundated with plastic, medical, and electronic waste of wealthier nations, a phenomenon mirrored by the peasant workers who flood the cities, begging for steady work and money to send home to their struggling families. These workers are employed sorting the endless heaps of trash into warehouse bins, acid baths, and incinerators, contaminated with heavy metals and carcinogens in the process. Lacking family protection or legal rights, rife with untreated wasting disease and lacking educational opportunities, the workers in the novel, derisively known as waste people, are held by company bosses and traded, almost like livestock, caught in a precarious balance of power between the three warring family clans to whom the island belongs. And yet it is notable that the natives and the waste people alike share a common dream, the ardent desire that their children grow up to escape this wretched place. Situated within an excruciatingly complex web of global business politics, class relations, and climate devastation, the isle itself serves almost as a sinister character in its own right, a hyperobject hunkering in its own filth, extending tendrils of control in all directions, dwarfing even the most powerful of the human actors that move throughout the story. Pushed to the breaking point, a young waste girl named Mei Mei, or Little Sister in Chinese, is able to organize and rally the waste people to revolt using her eerie and quasi-cyborg affinity for interfacing with the broken machines and dark web networks that surround and police the waste people's movements. But a violent crackdown on their initially peaceful protest leads to an armed struggle rife with bloodshed, class war slaughter, only halted by the vicissitudes of the isle itself, when a screaming typhoon descends upon the city. After a tense consultation and nearly deadlocked vote, the waste people, long used to fleeing environmental disasters, make the uneasy decision to turn back and to save the stranded natives who are trapped and drowning in the opulent homes that are now flooded with contaminated wastewater. A trash raft afloat a rising tide upon which refugees from all backgrounds huddle undifferentiated is here reconfigured as an ambivalent olive branch, gesturing toward the yet tenuous speculative possibility that Silicon Isle might be rebuilt after this storm, upon a grim foundation where shared trauma functions in the service of shared human solidarity. Sanchez and Pita's Lunabraceros is a likewise excellent piece of class-conscious Chicana futurist science fiction, one that also tackles decolonial themes. This novel is set in the 22nd century, late capitalist nightmare of corporate-owned states in which generations of the debt-bound poor are kept as slave labor on reservations, scattered throughout the former United States. Waste management and population management just become the same sort of thing as the capitalist and fascist government cleans up the unproductive elements of society and recycles them back into the service of profit. Kicked out of school and jailed for civil disobedience, the protagonist, Lydia, and a handful of other res-lifers become lunabraceros, conscripted into the service of radioactive waste management. They're cheaper to maintain than robots, and they're shipped to the moon to collect, move, and store the toxic waste of a dying planet, hoping to work off their sentences and buy their families freedom. But one day, in an improperly sealed waste container, they find the dead bodies of the Bracero crew who came before them. Further investigation reveals that an algorithmic analysis, a cost-benefit measurement approved by the top ranks, has determined that transporting waste workers off the moon is simply not worth the company expenditure. As an added bonus, a contractual loophole means they don't have to pay the families of the deceased. The human workers thus become conflated quite literally with the waste that they handle. Fighting for their lives, the Braceros use a panoply of technical, social, and martial skill to form a multilingual and multi-ethnic united front against their oppressors, liberating the base at gunpoint and hijacking a shuttle back to Earth. Lunar Braceros, like Waste Tide, thus emerges as a story of climate justice and rising anti-capitalist class consciousness. In so doing, the notion of debt shifts. When the system is laid bare and the deception revealed, debt becomes something owed to your fellow workers, to your community, and to your world, rather than to the bank. The material safety and freedom that the waste workers fight for pales in significance alongside the far more dangerous and insidious birth of the radical speculative imaginary, a violent break from normative systems of recycled exploitation. Namely, it's the realization that another better world is indeed possible. Eschewing fix all universals, whether in the service of order or of gleeful destruction, both novels attempt to visualize revolution as process on a smaller scale, specific to the needs of a given community, to be multiplied many times by many budding collectives. Meaningful change, like effective carbon removal, is temporally extended process, and it will span many generations. In both texts, the trauma of a poisoned climate, both economic and ecological, serve as a basis for radical worker solidarity and critical hope, reconfiguring the dominant narratives of the past to fight collectively for a sustainable future. In conclusion, I return to Buck's notion of waste management as debt repayment, but one that must necessarily be ideological rather than monetary. When debt ceases to be conceptualized in the service of profit and instead is understood as restoration and repair, then the unbalanced cycle can be broken. Waste management ceases to be an endless treadmill of exploitation, repression, and passing the buck, but instead becomes a moral obligation, a means of mobilizing the same waste in the service of both climate and class justice. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That was really interesting and packed, well packed.
Thank you very much.
I love how these papers are flowing together. It's really exciting. So thank you so much, everybody. And now for our last paper by Lucas Sabotin, who's an independent scholar in France, but with an academic training at Columbia University, at the University of Cambridge, and training in anthropology, religious studies, philosophy. His work addresses questions of rurality, agricultural, political economy, and social political autonomy. And he's also happens to be the managing editor of Green Humanities, for which we are very grateful. And so today he's going to be speaking about an eco-justice critique, a conservative ecology and ecological austerity. So Lucas, thank you.
Hello. Yeah, thanks so much. It's great to be part of this roundtable with you all. So yeah, first of all, for the sake of time, I had to cut out the critique of ecological austerity. So I'm focusing on ecological conservatism, which is something that I'll develop throughout the presentation. First of all, I want to start by saying that, excuse my cat who's getting in the way of the screen.
Cats are always welcome on this panel.
Okay, great.
I love Zoom pets.
Yeah. So yeah, this is going to be more of a conversation starter than a fully fleshed out comprehensive argument. I'm not an academic really, and this is not an extract of like a broader research project of mine. It's more of I guess like a provocation or a warning in a sense, based on the one hand, worrying recent political evolutions, and on the other, what I see as longstanding risks inherent in ecological thought in general, risks to what might be called eco-justice. And because I've been spending a lot of time recently in France, my main kind of case study, if I'm referring to public figures or other things, are going to be French people, French magazines, for example. What I'm principally concerned with addressing is the kind of ecology which poses the question of political economy. So that is not the business sustainability or green capitalism type of ecology. More specifically, in the sense it's, I guess, an anti-capitalist ecology, which challenges the way in which a capitalist political economy flattens, homogenizes, annuls differences, differences in value systems, ontologies, between different forms of life and different cultures, and so on. An ecology that is a more than human cry of protest, affirming the worth of things and beings, which capitalism has translated into mere exchange value, or is abstracted and fragmented into bits of information in a financialized economy. So in this kind of ecological politics, we see age-old tensions played out anew. So tensions between the universal and the particular, between identity and difference. To illustrate a bit further this kind of discursive political fabric of the kind of ecological politics I'm talking about, I'll lay out just some binaries. So there's capitalism versus ecology, space versus place, universal versus particular, abstract versus concrete, identity versus difference, laissez-faire or deregulation versus regulation, progress versus conservation, growth versus anti-growth or degrowth. So it's just the general kind of framework I'm working in here. So this ecological politics is in a sense about confronting value with values. In a way also, it's about building walls. So building walls to obstruct capital, among other things. Right. So what may be already coming through and what I'm saying is that there's something oddly conservative about ecological discourse and politics. In fact, it seems like ecological discourse and politics bear notable logical and structural resemblances to discourses of identitarian populism, fascism, and nationalism. The conservatism of ecology is not necessarily or altogether a bad thing, but at least the formal parallels to dangerous political orientations are worth pointing out and dwelling on. So a common phrasing might go like this. So there's a global force, progressive, transformative, uprooting or destabilizing or threatening the collapse of pre-existing organic units or communities, which needs to be fought by preserving these communities, by speaking and fighting on their behalf, and maybe even for the sake of political expediency, by exaggerating the case for the previous stability and unity of the said unit or community in order to win their emancipation from this brutal global force. So one way into addressing this messy situation is to turn to the words themselves. So take ecology itself, for example. Ecology comes from the Greek, so eco for home, logi, so for the study of science, logic. And we can start by asking ourselves the question, well, what homes are we talking about when we're fighting ecological politics? So a certain reductive type of ecology is merely nature-facing, taking nature as the sole or primary home. It involves biodiversity conservation, protection of wild spaces, rewilding, etc. And this is a scientific, management, kind of bureaucratic approach to ecology, which to be sure has great merit. French philosopher Félix Guattari, who towards the end of his life became engaged with environmental movements in his writing and his activism, spoke of three ecologies as a challenge to such reductivism, which he saw as superficial and risking reproducing politics of exclusion, like I've been hinting at so far. Guattari's three ecologies are one, subjective ecology pertaining to the affect, imagination, and so on. Two, social ecology pertaining to that which constitutes the social fabric on various scales, modes and relations of production, political and community organizations. And lastly, environmental ecology, which focuses on biodiversity, climate, nature, etc. This trilogy then becomes the groundwork for a comprehensive politics revolving around the driving concept of ecology, that is a politicization and a struggle over the various homes we live in and move through. So the homes that one has in mind when engaging in ecological politics matters. Now I'm going to shift to French far right, like the political far right in French, in France. So the fusion of home as nature and home as nation becomes the basis of dangerous politics of exclusion and demonstrates how snug ecology can fit into fascist discourse in politics. Marion Maréchal, the niece of Marine Le Pen, who's the leader of the French far-right party, the National Rally, Rassemblement National, is worth singling out specifically. In her speech at the 2020 National Conservatism Conference in Rome, she emphasized that, that ecology is a conservatism. That's her quote. She played explicitly on the etymology of the word as well. After pointing out that the eco in ecology is Greek for home, she states that, I quote, preserving our territories, the biodiversity of our landscapes should be the natural fight for conservatives. Jordan Bardella, the 26-year-old spokesperson for the National Rally Party and the deputy in the European Parliament, himself says, I quote, borders are the greatest ally of ecology. And it's worth noting that I think there should be nothing comforting in the fact that white nationalists are taking on an ecological fight. I think there's something good about that. That's a question that ecologists or anti-fascists should pose themselves. So in a similar way to shift to another example, in a similar way to Guattari, the French ecological magazine called Limite, or Limit, calls for an integral ecology. Limite's political stance and the articles it publishes are quite radical, with articles often explicitly or implicitly espousing anarchist, anti-capitalist positions. And yet there's this subtle identitarian, conservative Catholic thread, almost always present if you look closely enough. So it may, for the most part, or on the surface, be anti-nationalist. It remains in some way wedded to a Catholic universalism, which isn't necessarily any more reassuring. One article that I'll highlight clearly demonstrates the use of ecological language towards conservative biopolitical ends. The article, entitled "Oh Said, Previous First Home or Interchangeable Handbag," denounces the commodification and artificialization of our bodies, and ultimately calls out the immorality, based on the author's ecological politics, of various new reproductive technologies as being unnatural, as being, she uses like an anti-capitalist critique to call out new reproductive technologies and to critique them. So this logic can and does elsewhere in the magazine lead towards moralization and critique of pro-choice politics, and elsewhere of things like the right to euthanasia and so on. So the conservatism latent in much ecological discourse can easily become the legitimation or justification for insidious biopolitics, for policing women's bodies and so on. So language which sounds anodyne in the context of environmentalism becomes dangerous and almost fascistic when transposed to others, such as nationalism or politics of the body. We need to ask ourselves, I think, to what extent can ecology permit itself to use conservative and retrospective language before risking aligning itself with social conservatism and politics of exclusion or domination? That is, before abandoning its commitment to justice, to progressive social politics. We should also ask what defenses might need to be mounted, if any, by political ecologists against these kinds of appropriations of their discourse by far-right identitarian groups. One defense might go like this. So there's a difference between conserving or recovering an ecosystem and conserving or recovering a social and semiotic, the social and semiotic forms contemporaneous with that previous healthier ecosystem. 200 years ago, our planet was less threatened by global environmental catastrophe. Human societies had not yet had the devastating impact on other forms of life that they have today. And so nostalgia or conservatism from a biological, geological standpoint makes some sense and is even integral to a progressive ecological politics. Also 200 years ago, an extractivist, genocidal political economic system was materializing and colonizing the planet. Anthropocentrism or capitalocentrism was at the heart of this world system. So while the current ecological catastrophe was not an inevitability at that point in history, many of the ideological and political forces that are bringing it about today were already well articulated then. Therefore, conserving biodiversity, ecosystems, a relatively stable climate, and so on, have virtually nothing to do with conserving social, political, and subjective modes of being contemporaneous with that historical period of healthier ecosystems. This is one central reason why far-right conservative ecology is totally delusional, both in its reasoning and its politics. And it's why I also like Guattari's call to reinvent the environment instead of simply conserving it, by which he means reinventing the discourse and the institutions which mediate our relationship to the more than human world. So there's been a lot of work on eco-fascism and all this stuff. So maybe what I've been talking about is already pretty well known, and maybe I'm beating a dead horse. But nevertheless, it seems to me that as both environmentalism and National Socialist conservatism continue growing as matters of concern throughout the world, instrumentalization of the former by the latter will become increasingly problematic and insidious. So the transversal politics of ecology, if it wants to be anti-fascist, emancipatory, concerned with social justice, must explicitly take up the battle over what homes or home it's fighting for, past or future, conservative or progressive, closed and exclusive, or open, generous, optimistic, utopian. That's it, I'll end there. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much. This has really been a stimulating panel, a really important one, and one that crosses all different languages and barriers and continents. So I'm really excited about the outcome. I feel like I've traveled a lot, but in a grim way when we think of like China, Mexico, and Africa, even Rainer Barnard's Los Angeles. It's like wow, we definitely have time for a debate or for comments or questions. Although I don't have the right time. My computer is wacky. I have 12:26 East time. What do you guys have?
9:28 Pacific time.
Oh.
So I think you're
Okay.
just a couple minutes off.
Okay,
No
it
big.
doesn't matter. It won't,
Yes.
explode. Lisa, it was just one line that you said that shocked me, only because it's here. You said that there was like a Michigan-like water crisis in Suffolk, Virginia. When was that? I mean, it's not far from me, but I did not. I wasn't totally aware of that.
So the one in Suffolk, Virginia, was one that did not make the papers, but there was a new development that it was predominantly, well, it was not considered lower income housing, but it was predominantly Black neighborhood within Suffolk, Virginia. It was a new development. And from the exterior, the homes look beautiful. Inside, there was barely running water. The faucets were not fully functioning, and there were no wells in the area. So there were no like sort of natural ways of acquiring the water. But yes, like Flint, Michigan, there were in addition to within the home not having the like piping that they needed, they only had access to basically to tainted water. And this was happening, this was just like on the outskirts of the of the central area that was near, I guess like near Old Dominion University.
Hey, that's where I teach. Can you send me your article really quickly?
Surely,
I like,
surely. It was so
I drink
shocking
water
to
all the
find
time.
that out.
When, just out of curiosity, before when was this? What year was this?
So this was would have been like the early 90s
Wow.
when that development was built. And it's like the people living in that one little area, it's like they're on a completely different water line or something. It was the most bizarre thing.
Yeah, it is very bizarre and awful. And of course, was it corrected? I mean, it must be, right?
It was corrected.
Wow.
But it's interesting that apparently the people who lived there like didn't seem to have enough cultural capital to bring
Right.
about change, and so it was outside groups that put pressure on to get that corrected.
Wow.
Yes.
Yeah, this is why this panel is really important. It's like really telling us, well, it's for our survival and our personal survival that we have to, take action. By the way, I really encourage you to go to the other sessions today after this one, the general membership meeting of PAMLA. There are all sorts of exciting things happening right after this panel. So, well, I have tons of questions for every single presenter. But I will refrain from asking them. It's maybe you.
Well, I'd be interested in following up with Lucas about, it seems to me that you're very interested in this sort of tension between conservation and conservatism, specifically eco-fascist sort of ideas that humans are the virus, right? And that humans are somehow messing up this pristine wilderness, which is, of course, an ideology that tends to center white supremacy. It tends to center colonial ideas about how to properly use or not use land, et cetera, et cetera. And it's very fascinating. I wonder if you're drawing on any American Indigenous scholarship, which is really pushing against a lot of these really toxic reconscriptions of power, settler colonial power, this idea that humans are somehow the only stewards of the more than human world, and also paints wilderness itself as something of a social construct. I mean, humans are part of an ecology. So simply taking humans out of the picture in the vast majority of cases, particularly when it comes to, I'm thinking in the context of the American wilderness, et cetera, is not actually viable. Here in California, where I'm based, they have just after about a 200-year hiatus, for example, started to do controlled burns again in the Chaparral, right? And the Chumash people and the natives here had been doing that for centuries, if not millennia before. And when settlers came, they said, no, that's not how we do things. We fight the fire. But then, of course, we have these ridiculous roaring wildfires, which is partially because of that and partially, of course, because of climate change. So I guess I'd like to, I'm just wondering how you're drawing on this idea of wilderness as construct of climate justice as opposed to ecology or environmental science, etc.
Yeah, thanks for that. It's, yeah, really interesting. And I haven't, I'm not familiar with any Indigenous American writing. So it's not what I've been drawing on. Mainly, I guess what I've been basing, what I base this presentation on are more the more fascist expressions that I've been hearing throughout the media and in certain articles. And so, and on the flip side, maybe I'm drawing on Félix Guattari's Ecology. Otherwise, maybe James Scott actually has also been relevant a little bit in an American context, or I guess he's in the US, but he's not writing about the US, but societies living and organizing against the state. So I think he gives an example in one of his books about national parks state ecological projects to preserve wild areas by making national parks, which ends up being a kind of project to render everything on that territory legible and classified and inventoried, which ends up entailing a policing of the people who are living on that land.
Yeah, the non-humans as well. For example, controlling the bear population in Yellowstone or the bison. It's very carefully regulated.
Yeah. So yeah, beyond that, maybe so there's James Scott, Félix Guattari, and then otherwise just reading very unsettling news and some articles from this specifically this magazine that I recently discovered, Limite, the subtitle of which is Towards an Integral Ecology, which is a way of going beyond just well, I guess it's going beyond conservation ecology and talking about bodily practices or reproductive technologies and other things as artificial and therefore as part of the same struggle, same ecological struggle, which just gets into very scary territory.
Definitely. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I have a quick question for Baker before, because I was fascinated by the Waste Tide novel.
Yes.
I mean, it's something that really, the plastic issue and the people taking care of plastic and all that. I'm just curious how it was received in China, that novel. Was it written in China or?
Yes, it was written in Mandarin Chinese. I want to say 2015, and then translated to English in, I believe, 2019. So the translator is Liu Cixin, who is Ken Liu, who also wrote The Three-Body Problem, etc. To my knowledge, it was received well because it coincided with, it was just about 1 or 2 years before China actually closed its borders to plastic recycling. China no longer accepts the plastic waste of other nations, and that's part of their program of actually being quite ecologically conscious. Chen himself actually grew up in a coastal town where this was happening. And there's a documentary called Plastic China. I'll link it in the chat, but it really, it sort of was a public awareness campaign. And so it's interesting. A lot of Chinese political writing has to be pretty heavily either censored or buried under layers of obfuscation. A lot of it's in metaphor. A lot of it is something that it's not straightforward political critique because it's a very different political situation. But to my knowledge, this particular novel coincided with public and government sentiment at the time.
So he was lucky, actually, because
he was very lucky.
That's the only reason, because otherwise,
yeah. I don't actually think this novel could have been published maybe even a couple years before it was.
Right.
But he was lucky, and also that's one thing that Liu does is translates the works from Chinese into English, and some of it is actually only published online or in independent presses and is published anonymously. And so a lot of times some of this new Chinese science fiction actually gets more of an audience in English than in Chinese, which then conversely causes Chinese readership to grow. So it's a very interesting sort of scenario. I definitely recommend it, though. It's actually his first novel, and it's fantastic. Beautifully
I want
written.
to. I'm going to get it.
Yeah.
Other questions? Quick one, maybe then for Fannie, because about Rainer Barnard. When I read him, it was a long time ago as an undergraduate, and I thought he was like he opened my eyes to LA. And so I'm just curious, like as a Los Angelino, you're now, 2021. I know that was the theme of your paper, but I wonder if you could expand on his reception today and how he's conceived, how he's perceived as just old-fashioned, or be controversial or like prescient?
Yes, well, actually, quite the contrary. You know, it's still very relevant in many ways, especially when you think about how the imaginary ecology of Los Angeles is structured. So, as I was trying to show in my paper, and again, I'm sorry about this confusion. You know, I think I had communicated about the fact that I would present in French, but it will be, you know, there will be an English version very soon. So I'll be happy to send it to the panelists, you know, who were able to participate this morning. So anyway, is ecology, or is presentation of the 4 ecologies of Los Angeles, you know, how the city is structured around the highways, the foothills, the beach communities, and as I said, you know, earlier, the plains remain relevant today for most critics. Now the question is, as we are celebrating the 50th anniversary of the publication of, you know, the 4 ecologies of architecture, if we were to continue or expand this discussion initiated by Banham, you know, 50 years ago, could we think about a 5th ecology? Because in a certain way, Banham tried in his essay 50 years ago to think about what could be Los Angeles in the future, because he was aware that the city was, you know, undertaking a massive transformation, and he was already thinking ahead. So if we were to think about a 5th ecology today, there are some very interesting critics that are putting forward the idea of what about an ecology of fantasy, or of everyday life fantasy, as Margaret Crawford put it. And there is this ecology of care and repair, which basically really comes along a lot with what the other panelists were talking about, you know, especially Lucas in his paper. So yes, so that's and of course this conversation can be, you know, continued, and my proposition, as I was trying also to say, you know, was a sort of Proustian ecology, but that's more on a literary level. You know, that was the perspective I tried to bring forward in the essay that I published 2 years ago. So to summarize, you know, a few words, you know, that's the idea. But no, Banham remains absolutely relevant, and I think it just, in a certain way, created a tradition that still today, you know, is well ignored, and is definitely, yes, he created a critical tradition that we are trying today, up to this day, to ignore.
Lovely. So it looks like we're winding down. I have no trust in the watch that I have. It's like very independent. So I don't know.
If I could sneak in one question before we, it's a question for Elisa. Actually, I really appreciated all the papers. But I have a question. When you were talking about Pexton, this fictitious oil company, building a health clinic and a school to kind of serve as a smokescreen for the damage that they're causing in the community, I'm wondering if you thought about kind of connections that might have to kind of more subtle, like a greenwashing by companies, where their, you know, ecological impact is perhaps less pronounced as it is with the oil company there, but nonetheless trying to kind of you know, burnish their image while not really changing the fundamentals of what their business is about.
Yes, I think I could think it could definitely be that as well, with the more subtle ways. And I think Imbu is probably trying to make that statement by having it so overt. Because even from page 1, Pexton is, you know, it's, as I said before, it's like personified, and it's like that's the only way that it was referenced. Whereas with all of the characters, you have all of these names. pets didn't, there were no names associated with that. So everything was, you know, just kind of like shielded. And I absolutely see it that way. Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone.
You know, and to think of, I mean, it's like on so many of the pages, we would hear about one more child being dying. And, but she writes it in a way where it's not numbers, it's that we're getting to know a real person. And I think that's why all the children are named. And it's actually very hard to remember the names, you know, but they are all named. And then we find out, you know, maybe 3 pages later, oh, that child died. And then, you know, it's just like such a slap in the face to say, oh, well, a clinic is built for them. Yes. So I do see it that way, both the overt and the subtle.
Well, thank you, everybody. I hope I strongly encourage you to submit your papers to a Green Humanities session issue on environmental justice, because all these papers really flow really well. And I've taken like so many notes from. I've learned so much from this panel. So I'm really grateful, and from the chat. Thanks, speaker. That was like a lot of stuff that you shared with us. Really grateful.
I'm just the chat jockey everywhere I go. I'm just
Awesome.
linking.
Like
it's a bad habit.
Meta. Really appreciate the notes. So yeah, submit to us, and yeah, we'd be happy to, and let's continue this dialogue. I think. Yeah, we can do it through Green Humanities, all of you, and looking forward to it. Keep in touch.
Peter, I wanted to say a quick something. Peter?
Yeah.
I wanted to just say a quick something that I invited a student of mine, Katie.
Oh, hi, thank you for coming.
Yeah.
And just that I mentioned to the class that that this conference was taking place. And that there is the undergrad forum. I don't.
Yeah. It's do it. It's great. Yeah, do it. Yeah.
Okay, but yes, it's certainly something that is a real concern of the young people. Right? Do you want to say any more about that quickly?
I don't know. I thought the panel was like really interesting. I don't know. Like it's something like I'm like kind of like personally like into. And it was really interesting, like seeing like and listening to like everything everyone had to say. But yeah, I'd say this novel is like I'm really excited to read it. So yeah.
Yeah, me too. I'm gonna I've got a lot of a book list from this that I'm gonna be ordering tonight from this panel. Thank you very much for contributing to my already overpacked bookshelves. But
yeah, me too. With the eco poetry, with the 2 the Chen Clifton work and the Lunar Brancheros novel. Thank you.
Yeah,
thank you.
Baker. Thank you, everybody.
Fantastic.
And tune into all the rest, all the exciting panels, and hopefully, I think next year it's going to be at UCLA. So
I believe so.
So I'm excited about that too. Yeah.
Fantastic. Good to meet everyone.
Yeah.
Nice. Yeah.
Bye, everybody. Thank you again. This has really been amazing.
Thank you.
Experience. I'm really grateful.
Thank you so much for organizing this.
Oh, this was great. Good night.
Take care.
Bye.